This video is called Rhythm Take 2. It includes 16th notes, 16th rests, talking about the dot and the tie. So let's get started here. We have our 16th note, which looks a lot like our 8th note if you remember. Major differences being that it has two flags instead of just one. You can see right here. It also has a stem. It is full, it's not empty. It lasts a 16th as long as a whole note, and for our purposes it lasts a fourth of a beat. What that means is, if you think about it, 1/4 of a beat means that probably we're going to see a lot of them in groups of 4, so that it equals 1 beat. If we're using our takadimi syllables, just one of them gets ta, and then if you had 4 it would be takadimi. So that's there. So we just have 1 for ta. Now, it's the same breakdown as all of our other ones, meaning that if we have 2 16th notes, it's equal to 1 8th note, just like 2 8th notes was equal to 1 quarter note, and on and on and on. Just like our 8th notes, they can be beamed together so that it's easier to see and read and play. Usually you'll see them in groups of 4. Again, with our takadimi at the bottom here, with 4 of them, takadimi. 4 16th notes is equal to 1 quarter note. 2 16th notes is equal to 1 8th note. So a lot of black, a lot of flags might seem a little scary, but it's going to be okay. So the way they sound, I want to kind of demo it for you here. So if I'm playing my quarter note here, remember that I have 2 8th notes equaling a quarter note, so my 8th notes in this hand would be, if I switch to 16th notes in my right hand, and our 16th rest looks a lot like our 8th rest. So you can see it has 2 flags again, little dots and lines. Our 8th rest just had 1, our 16th has 2. Has a stem here, and again it lasts a quarter of a beat, or 16th as long as a whole rest. So thinking similarly in the way our patterns go, 2 16th rests equals 1 8th rest. So what does 2 16th rests plus 1 8th rest equal? Well, if we know 2 16th rests equal an 8th rest, we can assume here that this is an 8th rest plus an 8th rest. What does 2 8th rests equal? 1 quarter rest, or 1 whole beat. If you think about it in terms of beats, this is a fourth and a fourth, which equals a half. A fourth plus a fourth plus a half equals 1. You can think of it either way that makes sense in your brain. So if we're counting all of these things, it might look a little complicated, but you can handle it. So we have our quarter note here, which is worth 1 whole beat. Remember, the very next thing you see has to be the next number. So we would call the quarter note 1. Our next beat is 2, which is our 8th note. Now an 8th note doesn't take up a whole beat, right? It only takes up a half. So we need an and, which would be here on our 8th rest. And we have 4 16th notes, and we know that 4 16th notes equal 1 whole beat. So we would start our beat 3 on the first one that we see, and that would take up a whole beat. So then the next thing we see is beat 4. So you might see it counted this way. 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And you wouldn't be clapping all of those because we have 2 rests here. In terms of takadimi, ta is always on our downbeat. So we'd have ta, ta, thinking D for the rest, takadimi, ta for the rest here. So it sounds like rest, rest. You can handle it, it'll be okay. But the main thing to remember is this: avoid the urge to rush fast notes. Even though you see lots of black, lots of flags and lines, that does not mean just play it as fast as possible. It is going faster than some of the other things, but avoid the urge to rush those fast notes. You want it to be correct. So, moving on to the dot. In music, we have lots of random symbols that mean different things. The dot in our case here, is going to add to the duration of our note. If you found this dot underneath a note, it's going to mean something else, or on top of a note, it's going to mean something else. But our dot is going to be located to the side of our note, kind of like a freckle. And it's going to add half the duration of the note that it's attached to, which means that the dot does not have a consistent duration at all. It all depends on what it's attached to. For example, if we attach our dot to our half note, it's going to go to the right here. If we attach this little freckle there, it's adding half the value to the note that it's attached to. So if we know that our half note is worth 2 beats, it's going to add half of 2. Half of 2 is 1. So 2 plus 1 equals 3. It would be 3 total beats here. You can also think of it as adding the next smallest duration. So it'd be like adding a quarter note to the half note. That's easier for you to think of and to get the correct answer, then do it that way. So it would be a half note, or 2, plus a quarter note, or 1, equals 3. Get the same answer. If you add a dot to a quarter note, you can think of it as a quarter plus the next smallest duration, which is an eighth note. So a quarter plus an eighth note. And then to get the total number, a quarter note, which is 1 beat, plus half of 1, which is a half. 1 plus a half equals 1 1/2. You'd have 1 1/2 total beats for this one duration here. You can add a dot to anything. So if you're adding a dot to an eighth note, you're essentially adding a 16th note to the eighth note here. So if you're counting, an eighth note is worth a half a beat, and then a 16th note is worth a fourth of a beat. So 1/2 plus 1/4 gives you 3/4. And for larger ones, we can also see that. So our whole note here, which is worth 4 beats, the dot is adding half the value that's already there. So half the value of 4 is 2. So total we would have 6 beats. You can also, again, think of it as adding the next smallest duration. So a half note is added to a whole note to equal 6 total beats. One other thing that usually happens in our cases, we usually, not all the time, but usually find the note equivalent of the dot follows the note with the dot for these smaller values. So if you see a dotted quarter note, a lot of the time you'll see it followed by an eighth note because the dot is actually essentially adding an eighth note to it. So to make it whole of 2 beats, you tend to see the eighth note following that. Same with a dotted eighth note, you'll tend to see a 16th note following it, so you make it whole. So it's more even. Doesn't always happen that way, but we usually tend to find it that way. So for counting with our dotted notes, it does make it a little tricky. You have to think things in your head and not actually say it or perform it out loud. So for our dotted quarter note, we're essentially thinking a quarter note plus an eighth note. So it's 1 whole beat, and then we have to go on to the second beat because it's 1 whole beat just for the quarter note. So it would be 1, 2, but then we have to call the next thing something other than 3 because it's not actually 2 whole beats. And if you remember back to our counting of eighth notes, it's 1 and 2 and, or ta-dee, ta-dee. So if you're thinking of that in your head for this, our dotted quarter note is 3 eighth notes. So you would think 1 and 2, and then say and for this one, or ta-dee, ta-dee is this one. And then that in total has made 2 whole beats, so then we have to move on to beat 3, which we have as this dotted eighth note. Now you're thinking in your head that this dotted eighth note is the same as 3 16th notes. How do I know that? Well, an eighth note is the same as 2 16th notes, and our dot is adding half the value to this, which would be a 16th note. So we're essentially having 3 16th notes. So we're thinking in our head, and for our takadimi syllables, our 16th notes are takadimi for all 4. We have this dotted eighth note, which is worth 3 of them. So you're thinking in your head, takadi, and then the 16th note followed by it is mi to complete our 3 full beats. Then if we had something else, we'd move on to 4 or to the next measure. One other thing to point out is that we also have ties. Ties are another way to add duration to any note. So if you see this underneath notes connecting two of them together, you're essentially being told to add them together. So a tie underneath 2 quarter notes is like adding a quarter note and a quarter note together, which would equal a half note or 2 beats. So you could write it as a half note, or you could write it as a quarter note tied to another quarter note. And you can find these ties under any sort of rhythmic values. It doesn't have to be quarter notes, but you're just essentially going to add them together. You're not re-articulating, meaning if you were clapping, you wouldn't clap twice. You'd only clap once and think of the additional quarter note in your head to hold it for that.